The story of ancient Greece begins not with a single moment, but with the gradual awakening of human civilization across the sun-drenched islands and rugged peninsulas of the Aegean world. Long before the classical city-states that we associate with ancient Greece came into being, the Aegean world witnessed the rise of sophisticated Bronze Age civilizations that would lay the groundwork for everything that followed. The story begins around 3,200 years before the Common Era, when the islands of the Cyclades became home to a distinctive culture, known for its elegant marble figurines and skilled seafaring traditions. These early Aegean peoples developed maritime trade networks that connected the scattered islands, creating the first threads of what would become a vibrant Mediterranean exchange system. But it was on the large island of Crete, lying at the crossroads of three continents, where the first truly advanced European civilization would emerge. The Minoan civilization, named by modern archaeologists after the legendary King Minos, flourished from approximately 2,000 to 1,450 years before the Common Era. The Minoans constructed elaborate palace complexes that served as administrative, religious, and economic centres for their society. The greatest of these was the palace at Knossos, a massive structure covering more than 20,000 square metres, with hundreds of interconnected rooms arranged around a central courtyard. The palace featured sophisticated architectural elements including multiple stories, light wells that brought natural illumination deep into the interior spaces, elaborate fresco paintings depicting religious ceremonies and natural scenes, and an advanced plumbing system with terracotta pipes that provided running water and drainage. The Minoan civilization developed two distinct writing systems. The earlier, known as Linear A, remains undeciphered to this day, its secrets still locked away in the clay tablets found throughout Crete. The script appears to have been used primarily for administrative purposes, recording inventories and transactions in the palace economies. The Minoans were master craftspeople, producing exquisite pottery with flowing designs inspired by marine life, creating delicate gold jewellery of remarkable sophistication, and fashioning stone vessels with paper-thin walls that demonstrated extraordinary technical skill. Their frescoes reveal a society that celebrated nature, with images of dolphins leaping through blue waters, birds flying among flowering plants, and young people engaged in the dangerous sport of bull leaping, where acrobats would grasp the horns of charging bulls and somersault over their backs. Minoan society appears to have been relatively peaceful, at least in comparison to later Greek civilizations. The palaces were unfortified, suggesting either a lack of external threats or perhaps naval dominance that made land fortifications unnecessary. Women seem to have held significant roles in Minoan culture, appearing prominently in religious imagery and possibly wielding considerable social power. The religious life of the Minoans centered on female deities and natural sacred spaces. Mountain peak sanctuaries, sacred caves, and palace shrine rooms served as places of worship. The famous snake goddess figurines, with their elaborate dress and upraised serpents, hint at the importance of female divinity in Minoan belief systems. The Minoan civilization's influence extended far beyond Crete. Their ships carried goods throughout the eastern Mediterranean, establishing trading posts and cultural connections with Egypt, the Levant, Anatolia, and the Greek mainland. Minoan artistic styles and religious practices spread across the Aegean, particularly influencing the developing cultures of the Cycladic islands and mainland Greece. This cultural exchange would prove crucial in shaping the emergence of the next great Aegean civilization. On the Greek mainland, a distinct culture was developing that would eventually come to dominate the Aegean world. The Mycenaean civilization, named after its most prominent centre at Mycenae in the northeastern Peloponnese, emerged around 1,700 years before the Common Era. Unlike the Minoans, the Mycenaeans were fundamentally a warrior society, as evidenced by their massive fortification walls, weapons-filled tombs, and the martial themes in their art. The Mycenaeans spoke an early form of Greek, making them the first identifiable Greek-speaking people in history. This connection was definitively established in 1952 when the British architect and amateur cryptographer Michael Ventris successfully deciphered Linear B script, a writing system adapted from Minoan Linear A to represent the Greek language. The decipherment of Linear B revolutionized our understanding of Mycenaean civilization. The thousands of clay tablets found at palace sites like Mycenae, Pylos, Thebes, and Knossos revealed a highly bureaucratic society with detailed record-keeping systems. These tablets documented everything from livestock counts and agricultural production to textile manufacturing and bronze working. They listed offerings made to various gods, many of whose names would be familiar in later Greek religion, including Zeus, Poseidon, Hera, Athena, Apollo, Artemis, Dionysus, and Hermes. The tablets described a complex social hierarchy headed by a wanax or king, supported by a warrior aristocracy, and including various specialized craftspeople, merchants, and agricultural workers. Mycenaean palaces were built on hilltops and fortified with massive stone walls, constructed using enormous limestone blocks fitted together without mortar. These Cyclopean walls, so named because later Greeks believed only the giant Cyclopes could have moved such huge stones, could be 5 to 8 meters thick and rose to impressive heights. The most famous example is the Lion Gate at Mycenae, where 2 lions carved in relief flank a column above the massive entrance, the earliest known example of monumental sculpture in mainland Greece. Inside these fortifications, the palaces featured a distinctive architectural plan centered on a megaron, a large rectangular hall with a circular hearth in the center and a throne along one wall. This would become the standard layout for temples and public buildings in later Greek architecture. The Mycenaeans were sophisticated engineers and architects. They constructed corbelled vault tombs called tholoi, massive beehive-shaped structures built into hillsides. The treasury of Atreus at Mycenae, built around 1300 years before the Common Era, features a chamber over 14 meters high with a corbelled dome that remained the largest unsupported span in the world for more than 1,000 years. These impressive tombs contained elaborate grave goods including gold death masks, bronze weapons inlaid with precious metals, jewellery, and vessels of gold, silver, and bronze. The famous gold funeral mask known as the Mask of Agamemnon, though actually predating the legendary king by several centuries, represents the wealth and artistic sophistication of Mycenaean elite culture. The Mycenaeans expanded their influence throughout the Aegean, establishing settlements on numerous islands and along the coast of Asia Minor. Around 1450 years before the Common Era, they appear to have taken control of Crete, with Mycenaean Greeks ruling from Knossos for several generations. This period saw Linear B script used on Crete, recording Greek language texts within the formerly Minoan palace. The Mycenaeans maintained extensive trade networks, with their distinctive pottery found from Italy to the Levant and from Egypt to Anatolia. The famous Ulubaran shipwreck discovered off the coast of Turkey and dating to the 14th century before the Common Era carried cargo including Mycenaean pottery, Cypriot copper ingots, Baltic amber, African ivory, and glass ingots from various Mediterranean sources, revealing the complexity of Bronze Age trade networks. The legends of later Greece preserve memories of Mycenaean glory in the stories of heroes like Achilles, Agamemnon, Odysseus, and Heracles. The Trojan War, immortalized in Homer's Iliad and Odyssey, is set in the Mycenaean period, and archaeological evidence suggests there may be some historical basis for a major conflict involving Mycenaean forces in northwestern Anatolia. The magnificent palace at Pylos, with its archives of more than 1,000 Linear B tablets, gives us glimpses of Mycenaean life that resonate with Homeric descriptions of feasting warriors, sacrifices to the gods, and the careful accounting of a palace economy. Yet for all their power and sophistication, the Mycenaean civilization would not endure. Around 1,200 years before the Common Era, a wave of destruction swept across the eastern Mediterranean. Mycenaean palaces burned, cities were abandoned, and the elaborate palace economies collapsed. The Bronze Age was ending, not just in Greece, but throughout the region. The Hittite Empire in Anatolia fell. Numerous Levantine cities were destroyed. Egypt was invaded by mysterious sea peoples and trade networks disintegrated. The causes of this Bronze Age collapse remain hotly debated among scholars. Theories include invasions by outside forces, internal rebellions by lower classes against palace elites, natural disasters such as earthquakes or droughts, climate change disrupting agricultural systems, and the breakdown of the interconnected trade networks that Bronze Age economies depended upon. Whatever the precise causes, the effects on Greece were dramatic. The palace centres were abandoned and never rebuilt. Literacy disappeared completely as Linear B script fell out of use with the collapse of the palace bureaucracies. Population declined sharply, with archaeological surveys suggesting a population decrease of perhaps 50 to 75% in some regions. Overseas trade nearly ceased, cutting Greece off from the larger Mediterranean world. Monumental building projects ended, and the elaborate crafts that had characterized Mycenaean culture largely disappeared. Greece entered what scholars call the Greek Dark Age, a period of poverty and isolation that would last for approximately 3 centuries. The centuries following the collapse of Mycenaean civilization saw Greece transformed from a land of palaces and bronze-working warriors into a world of scattered villages and subsistence farming. This period, lasting from roughly 1100 to 800 years before the Common Era, was once viewed as a complete civilizational collapse, a dark age of barbarism between the Bronze Age glory of Mycenae and the classical splendor of Athens. Modern archaeology has revealed a more nuanced picture. While literacy was indeed lost and material culture simplified dramatically, these were also centuries of important social and political changes that would lay the foundations for the Greek civilization we know. During the Dark Age, people lived in small villages, often built on defensible hilltops. Houses were simple structures made of mud, brick and timber, far removed from the stone palaces of the Mycenaean era. Pottery became simpler in decoration, dominated by what archaeologists call the geometric style, featuring abstract patterns of triangles, circles and meanders. Iron gradually replaced bronze as the primary metal for tools and weapons, though the knowledge of ironworking developed slowly. The elaborate long-distance trade networks of the Bronze Age had collapsed, and Greece became more isolated from the broader Mediterranean world. Yet life continued and Greek culture evolved. The religious practices that had existed in Mycenaean times persisted and developed, with sanctuaries to gods like Zeus at Olympia and Apollo at Delphi beginning their long histories during this period. Oral poetic traditions kept alive memories and legends of the heroic past, building the repertoire that would eventually be crystallized in Homer's epics. Social structures based on kinship and personal loyalty replaced the bureaucratic palace systems, creating patterns that would influence Greek society for centuries. Communities were governed by local aristocracies, warrior nobles who owned the best land and dominated their neighbours through a combination of martial prowess, wealth, and hereditary prestige. Around 800 years before the Common Era, Greece began emerging from the Dark Age. Population started increasing again, new settlements were founded, and contact with the broader Mediterranean world resumed. Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet and adapted it to write Greek, adding vowels to the Semitic consonant-only system and creating the first true alphabet. This democratization of writing, which was far easier to learn than Linear B with its hundreds of syllabic signs, would have profound effects on Greek culture. The ability to write and read spread beyond scribal specialists, allowing for new forms of literature, record-keeping, and political participation. This period of renewal and expansion, lasting from approximately 800 to 500 years before the Common Era, is known as the Archaic period. It was an era of remarkable transformation that saw the development of the polis or city-state, the expansion of Greek settlement throughout the Mediterranean and Black Sea regions, the emergence of new forms of warfare and government, and the flowering of early Greek art, poetry, and philosophy. The polis became the fundamental unit of Greek political and social organization. Unlike the palace-centered Bronze Age kingdoms, the polis was a community of citizens who shared governance and military defense. Each polis consisted of an urban center with its surrounding agricultural territory. The urban area typically included an agora or marketplace that served as the civic center, temples to patron deities, and eventually walls for defense. The polis gave its citizens a strong sense of identity and belonging, creating what scholars call civic consciousness. The most important polis included Athens in Attica, Sparta in Laconia, Corinth on the isthmus connecting the Peloponnese to central Greece, Thebes in Boeotia, and Argos in the northeastern Peloponnese. Each developed its own character, traditions, and forms of government. Athens would become famous for its eventual development of democracy, its intellectual and artistic achievements, and its powerful navy. Sparta created a unique militaristic society focused on producing the finest infantry soldiers in Greece. Corinth dominated maritime trade with its position controlling access to the Peloponnese. Thebes built a reputation for fierce warriors and would briefly dominate Greece in the 4th century. These city-states were often rivals, competing for territory, trade and prestige. Population growth in the Archaic period led to land shortages in many Greek regions, spurring one of the most remarkable phenomena in ancient history, the Great Colonization. From the 8th to the 6th centuries before the Common Era, Greeks established hundreds of new settlements around the Mediterranean and Black Sea coasts. These colonies were independent polis from their foundation, though they maintained religious and sentimental ties to their mother cities. Greeks settled southern Italy and Sicily so extensively that the region became known as Magna Graecia, or Great Greece. They founded cities along the Black Sea coast, the northern Aegean, the coast of Asia Minor, North Africa, and even southern France and eastern Spain. This colonization was driven by various factors. Overpopulation and land hunger pushed many Greeks to seek new opportunities overseas. Political conflicts within city-states sometimes resulted in defeated factions being exiled or choosing to emigrate. The lure of trade profits encouraged merchant-oriented cities to establish outposts. Some colonies were founded to secure access to raw materials, particularly metals that Greece lacked. The process transformed the Mediterranean world. Greek culture spread far and wide, influencing indigenous peoples and creating a vast network of interconnected Greek communities. The colonies in turn influenced the Greek homeland, bringing new ideas, art styles, and wealth back to Greece proper. The Archaic period also saw important military innovations. The development of the hoplite phalanx revolutionized Greek warfare. The hoplite was a heavily armed infantry soldier, equipped with a large round shield, a spear, a short sword, and armour including a bronze helmet, breastplate, and greaves. The hoplite phalanx was a tightly packed formation of these soldiers, typically 8 rows deep, fighting shoulder to shoulder with their shields overlapping. Success in this formation depended on group cohesion and courage, as breaking ranks could lead to disaster. The phalanx became the dominant military formation in Greece, requiring city-states to maintain large numbers of citizen soldiers who could afford the expensive armour and weapons. The rise of hoplite warfare had profound social and political consequences. Where previously warfare had been dominated by aristocratic cavalry and individual champions fighting for glory, the phalanx required the participation of a broader class of citizens, the middling farmers who could afford hoplite equipment and whose disciplined cooperation determined the outcome of battles. These hoplite citizens began demanding greater political participation, challenging aristocratic monopolies on power. In many city-states, tyrants seized power during the 7th and 6th centuries, overthrowing oligarchic aristocracies, often with the support of hoplite citizens and the urban populace. Despite the negative connotations of the modern word, ancient tyrants were not necessarily bad rulers. Many implemented popular reforms, sponsored public building projects, supported the arts, and improved the condition of common citizens. This was also a time of remarkable cultural flowering. The epic poems attributed to Homer, the Iliad and the Odyssey, were composed in this era, synthesizing oral traditions about the Trojan War and its aftermath into monumental poetic narratives that would become foundational texts of Western literature. The Iliad tells the story of Achilles' wrath during the final year of the Trojan War, exploring themes of honor, mortality, and the relationship between humans and gods. The Odyssey recounts Odysseus' 10-year journey home from Troy, filled with adventures, monsters, and tests of cunning and endurance. These epics not only entertained but also provided Greeks with moral examples, religious instruction, and a shared cultural heritage that unified the scattered Greek world. Lyric poetry emerged as poets like Sappho of Lesbos, Archilochus of Paros, and Alcaeus composed personal poems about love, politics, and daily life, moving beyond the grand themes of epic. Hesiod wrote didactic poetry, including the Theogony, which organized Greek myths about the origin of the gods into a coherent narrative, and Works and Days, which offered practical advice for farmers and reflected on justice and the human condition. Greek religion crystallized into the forms familiar from classical times, with standardized myths, the 12 Olympian gods headed by Zeus, and major pan-Hellenic sanctuaries at sites like Olympia and Delphi that drew pilgrims from all Greek communities. The Olympic Games were founded traditionally in 776 years before the Common Era, or at least this is the first year for which we have records of victors. Held every 4 years at Olympia in honor of Zeus, the Games brought together athletes from all Greek city-states to compete in running races, wrestling, boxing, chariot racing, and the pentathlon. A sacred truce was declared during the Games, allowing athletes and spectators to travel safely even through hostile territories. Victory at Olympia brought enormous prestige to athletes in their home cities. The Olympic Games exemplified what it meant to be Greek, emphasizing athletic excellence, competition, and shared worship of the gods. They continued for over 1,000 years until being banned by the Christian Roman Emperor Theodosius in 393 years of the Common Era. Art evolved dramatically during the Archaic period. Pottery decoration moved from geometric patterns to naturalistic scenes depicting myths, daily life, and battles. The black figure technique, where figures were painted in glossy black slip on the red clay, allowed for increasingly sophisticated imagery. Sculpture developed from rigid stylized forms to the archaic smile and naturalistic bodies of Kouroi and Korai, standing male and female statues that were offered at sanctuaries or marked graves. Architecture became more monumental, with the development of the standardized temple form featuring columns, pediments, and specific orders, Doric, Ionic, and later Corinthian, each with distinctive capitals and proportions. These temples were built as houses for the gods, containing cult statues and serving as focal points for religious festivals. The rise of philosophy and rational inquiry began in the 6th century in the Greek cities of Ionia on the coast of Asia Minor. Thinkers like Thales, Anaximander, and Anaximenes began asking fundamental questions about the nature of reality, seeking natural explanations for phenomena rather than mythological ones. Thales proposed that water was the fundamental substance of all things. Anaximander suggested an infinite undefined substance called a pyrrhon. Heraclitus declared that everything was in constant flux, famously stating you cannot step into the same river twice. Pythagoras founded a quasi-religious community in southern Italy that explored mathematics and believed in the transmigration of souls. These early philosophers, often called pre-Socratics, laid the foundations for Western philosophy and science. Trade and commerce expanded dramatically during the Archaic period, facilitated by the introduction of coinage. The Greeks adopted the concept of minted coins from Lydia in Western Asia Minor in the 7th century before the Common Era. Coinage standardized value, made transactions easier, and facilitated the development of more complex economies. Major commercial centers like Corinth and Aegina grew wealthy from trade and manufacturing. Corinth was famous for its fine pottery, which was exported throughout the Mediterranean. The expansion of trade brought Greeks into contact with the ancient civilizations of the Near East and Egypt, exposing them to different ideas, technologies, and cultural practices that influenced Greek development. Two city-states emerged as the most powerful and influential during the Archaic period, following very different paths of development. Athens, in the region of Attica, was a large polis with substantial territory and population. In the early Archaic period, Athens was governed by an aristocracy, with power concentrated in the hands of a few wealthy families. But Athens would undergo a remarkable political transformation over the next 2 centuries, culminating in the development of the world's first democracy. Sparta, on the other hand, developed an entirely unique social and political system focused on creating an elite military force, turning the entire society into a warrior state unlike anything else in the Greek world. Athens sits in the region of Attica, controlling the entire territory of the Attic Peninsula, about 2,500 square kilometres. This made it one of the largest city-states in Greece in terms of territory, though its population in the Archaic period was probably around 30,000 to 50,000 people. The Athenians traced their ancestry to legendary kings, including Theseus, the hero who supposedly unified the villages of Attica into a single polis. According to tradition, Athens had never been conquered during the upheavals at the end of the Bronze Age, unlike other regions, and this gave Athenians a sense of their own distinctiveness as autochthonous, or sprung from their own land. In the 7th century before the Common Era, Athens was governed by 9 annually elected archons, magistrates chosen from among the wealthy aristocratic families. Real power, however, lay with the Areopagus, a council composed of former archons who served for life. This aristocratic oligarchy controlled Athens, with most citizens having little say in government. Growing tensions between the aristocracy and other classes, particularly over debt and the practice of debt slavery, threatened civil war. In 621, a lawgiver named Draco codified Athenian law, supposedly establishing extremely harsh penalties for even minor offences, giving us the word draconian. While Draco's laws may have been severe, codification made the law more transparent and limited aristocratic arbitrary power. The breakthrough came around 594 when the Athenians granted extraordinary powers to Solon, a respected aristocrat and poet, to reform the state and resolve the social crisis. Solon's reforms were revolutionary. He cancelled all existing debts and outlawed debt slavery, freeing Athenians who had been enslaved for debt. He divided citizens into 4 property classes based on agricultural production rather than birth, with political rights and military obligations corresponding to one's class. The wealthiest citizens could hold the highest offices, but even the poorest citizens, the thetes, could attend the assembly and serve on juries. Solon created a council of 400 to prepare business for the assembly. He revised laws and created a more equitable legal system. His reforms balanced the interests of different groups, angering extremists on both sides, but establishing crucial principles including prohibition of debt slavery, classification by wealth rather than birth, participation of all citizens in the assembly, and access to justice through popular courts. Solon's reforms did not immediately create a stable government. Athens experienced a period of political turmoil before Pisistratos, a popular general from an aristocratic family, seized power and established himself as tyrant around 560. Pisistratos and his sons, Hippias and Hipparchus, ruled Athens for most of the next half-century. Despite being tyrants who held power extra-constitutionally, they were generally popular and beneficial rulers. Pisistratos redistributed land to the poor, provided loans to small farmers, and encouraged agriculture. He undertook major public building projects, including improvements to the agora and the beginning of a massive temple to Zeus. He promoted religious festivals, particularly the Panathenaic festival honouring Athena, and supported the arts, supposedly being the first to collect and organise written versions of Homer's epics. The tyranny ended in 510 when Hippias, having become harsher after his brother Hipparchus was assassinated, was overthrown with Spartan help. What followed was a brief but intense political struggle between aristocratic factions. The victor was Cleisthenes, who in 508 implemented revolutionary reforms that laid the true foundation for Athenian democracy. Cleisthenes reorganized the citizen body, replacing the traditional 4 Ionian tribes based on kinship with 10 new tribes based on residence. Each tribe was composed of dems, local villages or neighbourhoods, drawn from 3 different areas: the coast, the city, and the inland region. This broke up regional power bases and forced citizens from different areas to work together. Each tribe selected 50 citizens annually by lot to serve on the Council of 500, which prepared legislation for the popular assembly. The assembly, open to all male citizens, became the sovereign body, voting on laws and major policy decisions. Cleisthenes also introduced ostracism, a procedure where once a year the assembly could vote to exile any citizen for 10 years without confiscation of property. This was meant to protect against would-be tyrants or citizens who became too powerful and threatened democracy. The name comes from ostraca, pottery shards on which citizens scratched the name of the person they wished to exile. If at least 6,000 votes were cast, the person with the most votes had to leave Athens for a decade. These reforms created the institutional framework for democracy. Power shifted from aristocratic councils to the popular assembly where all male citizens could participate, speak and vote. Decisions were made by majority vote. Offices were increasingly filled by lot rather than election, ensuring broad participation and preventing the formation of powerful political dynasties. Legal proceedings were conducted before large citizen juries. This was direct democracy, very different from modern representative democracy, where citizens themselves made decisions rather than electing representatives to decide for them. Just as Athens was developing its new democratic institutions, events were unfolding in the East that would shake the entire Greek world. The Persian Empire, the largest empire the world had yet seen, was expanding westward. Under King Cyrus the Great and his successors, Persia had conquered the Near East, Anatolia, Egypt and Central Asia, creating a superpower that dwarfed any single Greek city-state. The Greek cities of Ionia on the western coast of Anatolia had fallen under Persian control, ruled by local tyrants who owed allegiance to the Persian king. In 499, these Ionian Greeks revolted against Persian rule, seeking to establish democracies and free themselves from the empire. The Ionian revolt would draw mainland Greece into conflict with Persia, beginning a series of wars that would shape Greek history and identity for generations. Athens sent 20 ships to support the Ionian rebels, and Eretria on the island of Euboea sent 5. With this help, the rebels initially achieved some success, even burning the important Persian satrapal capital of Sardis. But the Persians eventually crushed the revolt by 494. The Persian king Darius I decided to punish the mainland Greeks who had supported the rebellion, and to bring Greece under his rule. In 490, a Persian fleet sailed across the Aegean, first conquering Eretria and enslaving its population. Then the Persians landed on the plain of Marathon, about 40 kilometres northeast of Athens. The Athenians marched out to meet them with their full levy of hoplites, perhaps 10,000 men, joined by 1,000 Plataeans from a small city-state friendly to Athens. Sparta had promised help but claimed religious obligations prevented them from marching immediately. The Athenian commander Miltiades convinced his fellow generals to attack despite being outnumbered by the Persian force, which may have numbered 25,000 or more. The hoplites charged across the plain at a run, crashing into the Persian lines. The Greek phalanx, with its heavily armoured soldiers and long spears, proved superior in close combat to the more lightly armed Persians. The Greek wings crushed the Persian flanks and then wheeled inward, surrounding and routing the Persian centre. The Battle of Marathon was an astonishing victory. The Persians fled to their ships, suffering heavy casualties. Supposedly 6,400 Persians died compared to only 192 Athenians, though these numbers may be exaggerated. The Athenians force-marched back to Athens to prevent the Persian fleet from landing there, arriving exhausted but in time to deter any further attack. The Persians sailed away. Marathon became one of the defining moments of Greek history, proof that Greeks could defeat the mighty Persian Empire. The victory gave Athens enormous prestige and confidence. The fallen Athenian warriors were buried on the battlefield under a mound that still stands today, honoured as heroes who had saved Greece. But the threat was not over. Darius died in 486, and his son Xerxes decided to mount a massive invasion to conquer Greece once and for all. Xerxes spent years preparing, assembling an enormous army drawn from across his empire and a fleet of hundreds of warships. In 480 he led this force into Greece. Ancient sources claim impossibly large numbers, with Herodotus stating that Xerxes commanded over 5 million men, but modern scholars estimate the Persian army at perhaps 150,000 to 300,000 soldiers, still an enormous force by ancient standards. The Persian fleet numbered around 600 ships. Facing this threat, many Greek city-states formed a defensive alliance, but others submitted to Persia, fearing they could not resist such overwhelming power. Sparta took military command of the Greek forces, providing leadership and the most feared soldiers in Greece. Athens contributed the largest fleet, having used the wealth from the silver mines at Laurium to build 200 warships over the previous decade, following the advice of the statesman Themistocles, who foresaw the need for naval power. The Greeks decided to make their first stand at the narrow pass of Thermopylae in central Greece, where the mountains came down to meet the sea. A small force could hold this pass against a much larger army that couldn't deploy its full numbers. King Leonidas of Sparta led a force of about 7,000 Greeks to Thermopylae. The core was his personal guard of 300 Spartan hoplites, all fathers of living sons, chosen because Leonidas expected they would fight to the death and wanted to ensure the family lines would continue. For several days the Greeks held the pass against wave after wave of Persian attacks. The narrow space neutralized the Persian numerical advantage, and their best troops, including the elite immortals, could not break through the hoplite phalanx. Then a local Greek named Ephialtes betrayed his countrymen, showing the Persians a mountain path that led behind the Greek position. Leonidas, realizing he was about to be surrounded, sent most of his force to retreat while he and his Spartans, along with Thespian and Theban contingents totaling perhaps 1,500 to 2,000 men, remained to cover the withdrawal. The Battle of Thermopylae ended with the Greek rearguard overwhelmed and killed to the last man after fierce fighting. Leonidas fell in the battle and the Persians took revenge on his body, but the sacrifice bought time and became a legendary example of courage and devotion to duty. The epitaph written for the Spartans, supposedly composed by the poet Simonides, captures the spirit. "Go tell the Spartans, stranger passing by, that here obedient to their laws we lie." The Greeks fell back and the Persians advanced, capturing and burning Athens. Most Athenians had fled to the island of Salamis in the Peloponnese, taking refuge on the ships of their fleet. Themistocles convinced the Greek allies to make their stand at sea in the Strait of Salamis, narrow waters where the Persian numerical superiority in ships would matter less. The Greek fleet of about 370 triremes, fast warships with 3 banks of oars, faced perhaps 600 to 800 Persian ships. Themistocles sent a false message to Xerxes suggesting that the Greeks were about to flee, prompting the Persian king to order an attack into the strait where his ships became congested and could not maneuver effectively. The Greek triremes rammed the Persian vessels, their bronze-clad rams smashing through wooden hulls. The confined waters turned into chaos as Persian ships collided with each other, rammed by Greek vessels and struggled to escape. The Greek victory was decisive, destroying perhaps 200 Persian ships with minimal Greek losses. Xerxes, watching from a throne on shore, saw his fleet shattered and his dreams of conquering Greece slipping away. The next year, 479, the Persians still had a large army in Greece under the command of Mardonius. The Greeks assembled their largest hoplite army yet, perhaps 30,000 to 40,000 soldiers, and met the Persians near the city of Plataea in Boeotia. The Battle of Plataea was the largest land battle of the Persian Wars. The Greek phalanx, after initial setbacks and confusion, crashed into the Persian lines with devastating effect. The heavily armoured hoplites, particularly the Spartans under the command of Pausanias, cut through the Persian forces. Mardonius was killed in the fighting, and his death broke Persian morale. The remnants of the Persian army fled back toward Asia. On the same day, according to tradition, the Greek fleet defeated the remaining Persian ships at Mycale on the coast of Asia Minor, ending the immediate Persian threat. The Greek victory in the Persian Wars had profound consequences. Greece had survived as an independent civilization, free to develop its own political systems and culture without Persian domination. The war forged a stronger sense of Greek identity, of being Hellenes united by language, religion, and shared values against the barbarian Persians. Athens emerged as a major power, having contributed the most ships and having rebuilt rapidly after the Persian destruction. The experience of democracy in wartime, where citizen sailors had saved Greece at Salamis, strengthened democratic institutions and gave common citizens confidence in their political judgment. The wars would be remembered as a defining moment in Western history, celebrated by the historian Herodotus, who wrote the first great work of history to explain how small, free Greek city-states had defeated the vast Persian Empire. In the aftermath of the Persian Wars, Athens took the lead in continuing operations against Persia. In 478, Athens organized the Delian League, a voluntary alliance of Greek city-states primarily from the islands and coastal regions. The League's stated purpose was to liberate Greek cities still under Persian control and to prevent any future Persian invasions. Member states either contributed ships to the League's fleet or paid tribute in silver to fund naval operations. The League treasury was kept on the sacred island of Delos, and an assembly of member states supposedly made collective decisions. Under Athenian leadership, the Delian League achieved remarkable success. The Athenian commander Cimon won a series of victories against Persian forces, liberating Greek cities in Asia Minor and around the Aegean. The League fleet cleared pirates from the sea lanes, making trade safer and more profitable. But Athens gradually transformed the League from a voluntary alliance into an empire. When member cities tried to withdraw, Athens forcibly prevented them, arguing that all members had sworn oaths to maintain the alliance. After the island of Naxos attempted to secede and was brutally suppressed, it became clear that membership was no longer voluntary. Athens moved the League treasury from Delos to Athens itself in 454, beginning to use League funds for Athenian building projects. Member contributions became tribute paid to Athens rather than contributions to a common cause. The transformation of the Delian League into an Athenian empire coincided with the political career of Pericles, the most influential Athenian statesman of the 5th century. Pericles came from an aristocratic family. His mother was a niece of Cleisthenes, but he championed radical democracy in the interests of common citizens. He was elected strategos, one of 10 annually elected generals, repeatedly from the early 450s until his death in 429, effectively leading Athens for over 3 decades. Under Pericles, Athenian democracy reached its fullest development. He introduced pay for jury service, allowing even poor citizens to take time from work to serve in the courts. He restricted citizenship to those whose both parents were Athenian citizens, creating a more exclusive citizen body. He promoted the dignity and importance of democratic participation, famously declaring in his funeral oration, as recorded by Thucydides, that Athens was the school of Greece, where power was in the hands of the whole people. Pericles used tribute from the empire to beautify Athens with magnificent public buildings. The most famous was the Parthenon, the temple to Athena Parthenos built on the Acropolis between 447 and 432, designed by the architects Ictinus and Callicrates, and supervised by the sculptor Phidias. The Parthenon represented the height of classical Greek architecture. Built entirely of Pentelic marble, the temple featured a Doric colonnade surrounding a cellar that housed a massive gold and ivory statue of Athena created by Phidias. The temple's proportions were carefully calculated to create perfect visual harmony, with subtle curves in the horizontal lines and slight inward tilts in the columns that compensated for optical illusions and made the building appear perfectly straight and balanced. The pediments and frieze were covered with sculptural reliefs depicting mythological scenes including the birth of Athena, her contest with Poseidon for Athens, and the Panathenaic procession. The Acropolis was transformed into a showcase of Athenian power and artistic achievement. The monumental gateway, called the Propylaea, provided a dramatic entrance to the sacred precinct. The Erechtheion, with its famous porch of the Caryatids, where columns in the form of draped female figures supported the roof, housed the ancient wooden cult statue of Athena and marked sacred spots including the olive tree that Athena supposedly gave to Athens in her contest with Poseidon. The small temple of Athena Nike celebrated Athenian military victories. These buildings demonstrated Athens' wealth, power, and cultural sophistication, serving as propaganda for the superiority of Athenian democracy and as expressions of religious devotion to the city's patron goddess. This period, often called the Golden Age of Athens or the Age of Pericles, saw extraordinary achievements in art, literature, philosophy, and science that would influence Western civilization for millennia. Athenian drama reached its peak with three great tragedians whose works remain cornerstones of world literature. Aeschylus, who had fought at Marathon and Salamis, wrote tragedies exploring fate, justice, and the relationship between humans and gods. His Orestia trilogy traced the curse on the house of Atreus from Agamemnon's murder by his wife Clytemnestra through the revenge killing by their son Orestes to final resolution through the establishment of lawful courts, reflecting Athens' own evolution from blood feuds to legal justice. Sophocles wrote over 120 plays, 7 of which survive complete. His works, including Oedipus Rex, Antigone, and Oedipus at Colonus, explored human suffering, moral dilemmas, and the limitations of human knowledge. Oedipus Rex, considered by Aristotle to be the perfect tragedy, told how Oedipus unknowingly fulfilled a prophecy that he would kill his father and marry his mother, discovering the horrible truth only after the deeds were done. The play examined the nature of fate, the search for truth, and the fragility of human happiness. Antigone presented the conflict between human law and divine law, individual conscience and state authority, through the story of Antigone defying King Creon's order not to bury her brother. Euripides, the youngest of the three great tragedians, pushed boundaries with psychologically complex characters and challenging of traditional values. His plays, including Medea, the Bacchae, and the Trojan Women, presented female characters with depth and agency unusual in Greek literature, questioned the justice of the gods, and portrayed the horrors of war with brutal honesty. Medea shocked audiences with its depiction of a woman murdering her own children to punish her unfaithful husband. The Trojan Women, produced during the Peloponnesian War, showed the suffering of women captured after Troy's fall, serving as implicit criticism of Athenian treatment of conquered cities. These tragedies were performed at the festival of Dionysus, religious celebrations where playwrights competed for prizes before audiences of thousands of citizens. Comedy also flourished, with Aristophanes producing brilliant satirical plays that mocked politicians, intellectuals, and contemporary events. His works including The Clouds, which ridiculed Socrates and the sophists, Lysistrata, where women end war by refusing sex with their husbands, and The Frogs, which showed Dionysus descending to Hades to bring back a great tragedian, combined crude humour with sophisticated commentary on Athenian society and politics. Philosophy and intellectual inquiry flourished in Athens. Sophists, travelling teachers who offered instruction in rhetoric, politics, and philosophy for fees, challenged traditional values and claimed to teach virtue. Protagoras famously declared that man is the measure of all things, suggesting that truth was relative rather than absolute. Gorgias demonstrated the power of rhetoric to make the weaker argument appear stronger. These ideas excited some Athenians, but troubled others who worried that traditional morality and religion were being undermined. Socrates, an Athenian stonemason's son, spent his days questioning fellow citizens about justice, virtue, knowledge, and the good life. Unlike the sophists, he claimed to possess no wisdom himself, but rather to be searching for truth through rigorous questioning and logical analysis. His method, now called the Socratic method, involved asking probing questions that revealed contradictions in people's beliefs, pushing them toward clearer thinking. Socrates attracted devoted followers, particularly young aristocrats like Plato, but also made enemies among politicians and traditionalists who resented his questioning of accepted beliefs. He served bravely in the Athenian army and followed the laws of the city, but his philosophical activity and association with students who later betrayed Athens would eventually lead to his trial and execution. Herodotus, called the father of history, wrote his histories to explain the Persian Wars, travelling widely to gather information and recording not just military events, but the customs, geography, and stories of the various peoples of the Mediterranean and Near East. His work combined serious historical inquiry with entertaining digressions, preserving vast amounts of information about the ancient world. The sculptor Phidias created works that defined the classical style, including the Athena Parthenos in the Parthenon and the statue of Zeus at Olympia, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. His sculptures achieved ideal beauty through mathematical proportions, while conveying a sense of calm dignity and restrained power. Other sculptors like Myron and Polykletos refined the representation of the human body in motion and at rest, developing canons of ideal proportions and creating bronze statues that seemed to breathe with life. Vase painting reached new heights of artistry with the red figure technique, where figures were left in the red colour of the clay against a black background, allowing for greater detail and more naturalistic representation of anatomy and drapery. Architecture standardized the classical orders, with the Doric, Ionic and Corinthian styles used according to the character of the building and aesthetic preferences of the builders. Athenian architects achieved perfect proportions and harmony in their buildings, creating structures that appeared both monumental and graceful. The use of subtle curves and optical refinements showed sophisticated understanding of how the human eye perceives buildings. Music and lyric poetry continued traditions from the archaic period while developing new forms. The symposium, a drinking party for elite men, served as a venue for the performance of poetry and philosophical discussion. Athletic competition remained central to Greek culture, with the Olympic Games and other pan-Hellenic festivals continuing to bring Greeks together in peaceful competition. Medicine and science made important advances. Hippocrates of Kos, active in the late 5th century, revolutionized medicine by seeking natural causes for diseases rather than attributing them to divine punishment or supernatural forces. He emphasized careful observation of symptoms, recording of case histories, and natural treatments. The Hippocratic Corpus, a collection of medical texts attributed to him and his followers, established ethical standards for physicians, including the famous Hippocratic Oath. Other thinkers explored mathematics, astronomy, and natural philosophy, building on the work of the earlier Ionian philosophers and laying foundations for scientific thought. Yet beneath this cultural brilliance, tensions were building that would tear Greece apart. The Athenian Empire, enriching Athens and allowing its artistic flowering, was resented by many Greeks who saw Athens as a tyrant city, exploiting its supposed allies. Sparta, the military powerhouse of Greece, watched Athens' growing power with alarm. Sparta led the Peloponnesian League, an alliance of conservative oligarchic states opposed to Athenian democracy and imperialism. Conflicts of interest, rival alliances and mutual suspicion pushed Athens and Sparta toward confrontation. The Peloponnesian War, lasting from 431 to 404, was a catastrophic conflict that engulfed virtually the entire Greek world, pitting the Athenian Empire and its allies against the Spartan-led Peloponnesian League. The historian Thucydides, who participated in the war as an Athenian general and then chronicled it in his History of the Peloponnesian War, saw it as the greatest upheaval in Greek history, surpassing even the Persian Wars in its impact on Greek civilization. The immediate causes of the war involved conflicts between Athens and Corinth, a major Spartan ally, over influence in northwest Greece. But the underlying cause was Spartan fear of growing Athenian power. Sparta and Athens represented almost opposite models of Greek society. Sparta had developed a unique social and military system unlike any other Greek state. Spartan society was divided into 3 classes: the Spartiates, full citizens who were professional soldiers; the Priousi, free but non-citizen inhabitants who engaged in commerce and some military service; and the Helots, state-owned agricultural slaves who outnumbered the Spartiates by perhaps 7 or 10 to 1. This massive enslaved population, primarily descendants of conquered peoples, required constant military vigilance to prevent revolt. To maintain control, Sparta had transformed itself into a military state where male citizens devoted their lives to warfare. Spartan boys left home at age 7 to begin the agoge, a brutal state education system focused on military training, physical toughness, and obedience. They lived in barracks, trained in armed combat, endured hunger and hardship, and learned to endure pain without complaint. At 20, having survived the rigours of the agoge, young men became full soldiers and joined common mess groups where they ate meals together for the rest of their lives. Even after marriage, men lived primarily in the barracks, visiting their wives briefly and secretly. Full Spartan citizens were forbidden from engaging in trade or agriculture, which would distract from military training. Instead, they lived off the produce provided by their helot labour, spending their time in constant military preparation. Women in Sparta had more freedom and status than in other Greek cities, managing households and property while men lived in barracks, engaging in athletic training, and participating in religious rituals. This system produced the finest infantry soldiers in Greece. Spartan hoplites were professionals who trained year-round, unlike citizen soldiers of other Greek states who were primarily farmers. They fought with legendary discipline and courage, never breaking ranks or fleeing. Other Greeks both admired and feared Spartan military prowess. However, Sparta's social system was rigid and conservative. Fearing that change would undermine their control over the Helots, Spartans resisted innovation, rarely travelled outside the Peloponnese, discouraged intellectual and artistic pursuits, and maintained oligarchic government at home, while supporting oligarchies in other states. This conservatism put them at odds with democratic, culturally vibrant and expansionist Athens. When war began in 431, the two sides had very different strengths. Sparta possessed the finest army in Greece, able to field about 9,000 Spartiates plus Periocean allies. Athens, on the other hand, had the largest and most skilled navy, with nearly 300 triremes and experienced crews. Pericles developed Athens' strategy, recognizing that Athens could not defeat Sparta in pitched land battle. Instead, Athens would avoid major land battles, rely on its long walls connecting the city to its port Piraeus to maintain sea access, use its navy to raid the Peloponnese, and protect grain shipments from the Black Sea, and wait for Sparta to give up. Athens could endure indefinitely behind its walls with naval superiority and imported food, while Sparta would supposedly tire of annual invasions that achieved nothing. The strategy seemed sound, but in 430 disaster struck Athens. A plague, probably typhoid fever or typhus, entered Athens from ships and spread rapidly through the overcrowded city, where the entire rural population of Attica had taken refuge behind the walls. The disease killed perhaps a quarter to a third of Athens' population over 3 years. Symptoms included high fever, inflammation of the throat and tongue, cough, severe diarrhea, and often delirium. Many victims died within a week. The plague killed both civilians and soldiers, rich and poor, undermining Athens' military strength and shattering morale. Even Pericles, the architect of Athenian strategy and its most influential leader, died of the plague in 429, leaving Athens without his steady guidance. Without Pericles, Athenian policy became more aggressive and erratic. Leaders like Cleon, a tanner who represented more radical democratic elements, pushed for harsher treatment of rebellious allies and more aggressive military operations. After the city of Mytilene on Lesbos revolted, Athens debated executing all adult men and enslaving the women and children. The assembly initially voted for mass execution, but reconsidered the next day and sent a fast trireme to overtake the ship carrying the execution order, arriving just in time to prevent the massacre. Still, Athens executed the leaders of the revolt and confiscated land. Such brutality revealed how the war was coarsening Athenian democracy. In 425, Athens achieved a stunning success when a force commanded by Cleon and the general Demosthenes trapped and forced the surrender of about 120 Spartan hoplites on the island of Sophacteria. This was shocking because Spartans were supposed to never surrender. The captured Spartans provided Athens with valuable hostages, and Sparta offered peace terms that Athens, confident of total victory, refused. The war continued with varying fortunes for both sides. Athens attempted a massive expedition to conquer Syracuse in Sicily from 415 to 413, hoping to gain resources and cut off grain supplies to the Peloponnese. The expedition ended in complete disaster. 2 large fleets and armies were destroyed, thousands of Athenians died or were enslaved in Syracusan stone quarries, and Athens lost many of its best generals including Nicias and Alcibiades. The Sicilian disaster nearly broke Athens, but the city showed remarkable resilience, building new fleets and continuing the fight. The final phase of the war shifted to the Aegean, as Sparta, with Persian financial support, built a fleet to challenge Athenian naval superiority. The brilliant but erratic Athenian general Alcibiades, who had defected to Sparta and then Persia before returning to Athens, won several victories but could not decisively defeat the improved Spartan navy. In 405, the Spartan admiral Lysander destroyed the Athenian fleet at Aegospotami in the Hellespont. With its navy gone and grain shipments cut off, Athens could not continue. The city held out through the winter, but starvation forced surrender in 404. Sparta imposed harsh peace terms. Athens was forced to destroy its long walls and fortifications, surrender its fleet except for 12 ships, dissolve the Delian League, and accept a Spartan-imposed oligarchy called the 30 Tyrants. This oligarchic government quickly became brutally oppressive, executing or exiling democratic leaders and confiscating property. Within a year, democratic forces rallied under Thrasybulus, fought their way back into Athens, and overthrew the 30 Tyrants. Democracy was restored, and Sparta surprisingly allowed this, having achieved its primary war aims of breaking Athenian power. The Peloponnesian War had catastrophic effects on Greece. Hundreds of thousands died in combat from disease or in massacres. Economies were devastated by decades of continuous warfare. Cities were destroyed, populations enslaved, and agricultural land ravaged. Traditional values and beliefs were undermined by the brutalities of the war. Thucydides recorded how civil strife in Corcyra descended into savage violence, where all moral restraints collapsed, families were torn apart, and death in every form ran through the city. The trust and cooperation between Greek states that had united them against Persia was shattered. Athens, the cultural beacon of Greece, was humbled and impoverished. Sparta had won but lacked the resources, vision, or political skill to create a stable peace. The period immediately following Athens' defeat saw Sparta attempt to impose its will on Greece, supporting oligarchic governments in other cities, and garrisoning important locations with Spartan troops. But Spartan hegemony was brief and unpopular. Sparta's harsh treatment of former allies like Thebes, its interference in local affairs, and its general high-handedness alienated many Greeks. In 395, a coalition of Thebes, Athens, Corinth, and Argos challenged Sparta in the Corinthian War. With Persian financial support switching to Sparta's enemies, the war dragged on for years. Athens used Persian gold to rebuild its navy and walls, gradually recovering some of its former strength. The King's Peace of 387, imposed by the Persian king with Spartan cooperation, ended the war but left Persia as arbiter of Greek affairs, a humiliating reversal after the Greek victories of the Persian Wars. Thebes emerged as the next challenger to Sparta. Under brilliant generals Epaminondas and Pelopidas, Thebes developed new military tactics and welded its army into an effective fighting force. The Sacred Band, an elite unit of 150 pairs of male lovers who swore to never retreat or abandon their partners, became the core of Theban military power. In 371, at the Battle of Leuctra, Epaminondas revolutionized Greek warfare by massing his best troops on the left wing in an unprecedented deep formation of 50 ranks, which crashed through the Spartan right wing and killed the Spartan king Cleombrotus. This shocking defeat shattered the myth of Spartan invincibility. Epaminondas followed up by invading the Peloponnese, freeing the Helots of Messenia from Spartan control and founding the city of Messene as their capital. Deprived of half its Helot labour force, Sparta could never again field large armies and rapidly declined as a major power. Theban dominance lasted less than a decade. In 362, Epaminondas was killed at the Battle of Mantinea while leading his army to victory. Without his leadership and vision, Thebes could not maintain hegemony. Greece entered a period of weakness and exhaustion where no single city-state could dominate. The constant warfare of the 4th century had drained Greek cities of men, money, and confidence. Into this power vacuum would step a semi-barbarian kingdom from the northern fringes of the Greek world, Macedonia, which would unite Greece under its rule and carry Greek culture to the ends of the known world. Macedonia lay in northern Greece, a mountainous kingdom that Greeks considered backward and barely Greek. Macedonians spoke a Greek dialect but maintained monarchical government and tribal social structures that seemed primitive to sophisticated Athenians. They were fierce warriors and skilled horsemen, but lacked the cultural refinement of southern Greece. Greek city-states viewed Macedonia with a mixture of contempt and wariness. Contempt for its supposed barbarism, and wariness of its military potential. In 359, a young prince named Philip came to the Macedonian throne. Over the next 23 years, he would transform Macedonia from a weak border kingdom into the dominant power in Greece and create the military machine that would conquer the Persian Empire. Philip II had spent several years as a hostage in Thebes during his youth, where he observed the military innovations of Epaminondas and learned Greek diplomatic arts. When he seized the throne, Macedonia faced multiple threats from Illyrian tribes to the west, Paeonian raiders to the north, and Greek cities along the coast plotting to weaken Macedonian power. Philip moved quickly to secure his position, using diplomacy, bribery, and strategic marriages to neutralize enemies or turn them into allies. He reformed the Macedonian army, creating new military formations and training programs that would make it the most effective force in the ancient world. Philip's greatest military innovation was the Macedonian phalanx, different from the traditional Greek hoplite phalanx. His soldiers, called pejetairoi or foot companions, carried the sarissa, a pike up to 6 meters long, much longer than the spears of Greek hoplites. The phalanx was organized in units with overlapping sarissas, creating a forest of pike points that was nearly impossible for enemy infantry to penetrate. Behind this nearly impenetrable pike wall, Philip deployed his heavy cavalry, the hetairoi or companion cavalry, made up of Macedonian nobles fighting alongside their king. This combination of phalanx and cavalry gave Philip tactical flexibility that traditional Greek armies lacked. The phalanx would pin enemy forces in place while the cavalry charged to deliver the decisive blow. Philip also developed siege warfare capabilities that Greeks had largely neglected. He employed engineers who built sophisticated siege towers, battering rams, and torsion catapults that could hurl stones or bolts great distances. With these technologies, Philip could capture fortified cities that previously would have been impossible to take. His army was professional and well-trained, maintained year-round rather than assembled seasonally like Greek citizen militias. Soldiers were paid, drilled constantly, and could march long distances carrying their own supplies, giving Philip strategic mobility that allowed him to campaign anywhere in Greece. Philip expanded Macedonian territory systematically, conquering Thracian tribes to the east and securing access to gold and silver mines that funded his military and diplomatic efforts. He founded new cities to consolidate his gains, populated them with mixed populations of Macedonians and locals, and built roads to facilitate troop movements. He cultivated Greek culture at his court, inviting poets, philosophers, and artists to Pella, the Macedonian capital. He competed in the Olympic Games, asserting his Greekness and legitimacy as a Hellenic ruler. When he turned his attention to southern Greece, Philip used a combination of military force, diplomatic manipulation, and shrewd alliances to extend Macedonian influence. The Greek city-states were slow to recognize the Macedonian threat. Athens, the most vocal opponent of Macedonian expansion, was led by the great orator Demosthenes, who delivered a series of speeches called the Philippics, warning of Philip's ambitions and urging Greek unity against him. But Athens was weaker than in its imperial days, its treasury depleted, its population reduced, and its will to fight uncertain. Other cities were bought off by Philip's gold, intimidated by his military successes, or paralyzed by internal divisions. Some, like Thessaly, allied with Philip and contributed cavalry to his forces. In 348, Philip captured the important city of Olynthus, destroying it and enslaving its population as a warning to other Greek cities. The sacred war over control of the sanctuary of Delphi gave Philip an opportunity to intervene in central Greek affairs. He positioned himself as a defender of Delphi against Phocian sacrilege, won victories that earned him gratitude from cities like Thebes, and gained influence in the Amphictyonic League, the organization that administered pan-Hellenic religious affairs. Step by step, Philip extended his power southward. By 338, conflict became inevitable. Athens and Thebes, traditional rivals now allied against the common Macedonian threat, assembled a combined army to stop Philip's advance. The The two sides met at Chaeronea in Boeotia in August 338. The Battle of Chaeronea was decisive. Philip commanded the Macedonian right wing and held back while his 18-year-old son Alexander led the companion cavalry on the left. Alexander's charge shattered the Theban sacred band, which fought to the last man rather than retreat. Philip's feigned withdrawal on the right drew the Athenian line forward, breaking its cohesion. Then the Macedonian phalanx counterattacked and crushed the disordered Athenians. The allied Greek army was destroyed, with thousands killed or captured. Thebes and Athens had no choice but to accept Macedonian terms. Philip treated Athens with surprising leniency, perhaps out of respect for its cultural achievements, but installed a Macedonian garrison in Thebes. In 337, Philip summoned delegates from Greek city-states to Corinth, where he organized the League of Corinth, a confederation of Greek states under Macedonian leadership. The League proclaimed a common peace among Greeks and announced its intention to wage war against Persia to avenge Persian invasions of Greece and liberate Greek cities in Asia Minor. Philip was elected hegemon, or leader of the League's military forces, effectively giving him command of combined Greek and Macedonian armies. Greece was unified under Macedonian control, and Philip prepared for his Great Eastern Campaign. But Philip would not lead this expedition. In 336, at the wedding of his daughter, Philip was assassinated by Pausanias, one of his bodyguards, whose motives remain unclear but may have involved personal grievances or possibly conspiracy involving Philip's wife, Olympias, and her son, Alexander. Philip died at age 46, having transformed Macedonia from a marginal kingdom into the dominant power in Greece and created the military instrument that would conquer the known world. Leadership of that conquest would pass to his brilliant young son, Alexander III, who would surpass even his father's achievements and earn the epithet, the Great. Alexander was only 20 years old when his father was assassinated, but he moved quickly to secure his position. He eliminated potential rivals to the throne, putting down a rebellion in Thrace, and demonstrating that he would be as ruthless and capable as Philip. When Thebes rebelled, hoping to throw off Macedonian control in the confusion following Philip's death, Alexander marched south with stunning speed and destroyed the city completely, sparing only the temples and the house of the poet Pindar. 6,000 Thebans were killed and 30,000 sold into slavery. The destruction of this ancient city shocked Greece into submission. No other city dared challenge the young king. Alexander was elected hegemon of the League of Corinth, taking his father's place as leader of the planned Persian expedition. In spring 334, Alexander led his army across the Hellespont into Asia. The army numbered approximately 40,000 infantry and 5,000 cavalry, combining Macedonians, Greek allies and mercenaries, and troops from Thracian and Illyrian regions. It was relatively small compared to Persian forces, but superbly trained and led. Alexander brought engineers, surveyors, scientists, historians, and a personal physician, Aristotle's nephew. The expedition was not just military conquest, but also exploration and the spreading of Greek culture. Alexander visited Troy, where he sacrificed at the supposed tomb of Achilles, claiming the hero as his ancestor through his mother Olympias, and comparing his expedition to the legendary Trojan War. The first major battle came at the Granicus River in northwestern Asia Minor. Persian satraps had assembled an army to stop the Macedonian invasion, positioning their cavalry along the riverbank to contest the crossing. Alexander personally led the companion cavalry in a dangerous river crossing under missile fire, fighting his way onto the far bank in the thick of combat. His helmet was split by a Persian sword, and he was saved only by the intervention of his general Clytus the Black, who killed Alexander's attacker. The Macedonian phalanx crossed after the cavalry secured the banks, and the Persian army broke and fled. This victory opened Asia Minor to Alexander, and Greek cities there revolted against Persian rule and welcomed the Macedonians as liberators. Alexander spent the next year campaigning through Asia Minor, capturing cities, installing friendly governments, and organizing his growing empire. Some cities surrendered peacefully, others resisted and were taken by storm. At Gordium, capital of ancient Phrygia, Alexander encountered the famous Gordian Knot, a complex knot tied by the legendary King Gordius and embedded in a pole in a temple. An oracle proclaimed that whoever untied the knot would rule Asia. Alexander, seeing no easy way to untie it, simply cut through the knot with his sword, a symbolic act showing his direct approach to problems and his confidence in his destiny. In autumn 333, Alexander confronted the main Persian army under King Darius III at Issus in southern Asia Minor. Darius commanded perhaps 100,000 men, vastly outnumbering Alexander's forces. The battle was fought in a confined space between the mountains and the sea, limiting Persian numbers' advantage. Alexander led the companion cavalry in a diagonal charge toward Darius's position in the centre of the Persian line. The Macedonian phalanx engaged the Persian infantry while Alexander's cavalry smashed through the Persian left and drove toward the king. Darius, seeing the Macedonians breaking through his lines and Alexander riding directly at him, panicked and fled. The Persian army, seeing their king retreat, disintegrated into flight. Thousands were killed in the pursuit, and Darius abandoned his camp, his treasure, and even his family, his mother, wife, and daughters falling into Alexander's hands. Alexander treated the Persian royal women with great courtesy, respecting their status and providing for their needs. After Issus, Alexander turned south into Syria and Phoenicia rather than pursuing Darius immediately. He needed to secure the Mediterranean coast to protect his supply lines and prevent the Persian fleet from raiding Greek territories. Most Phoenician cities submitted, but Tyre, protected by its island location, refused. Alexander besieged Tyre for 7 months from January to July 332, building a causeway from the mainland to the island city and bringing up siege engines to breach the walls. When the city finally fell, Alexander's fury at the long resistance led to massacre and enslavement. 8,000 Tyrians were killed and 30,000 enslaved. The causeway Alexander built still connects Tyre to the mainland today, having accumulated sand and sediment over the centuries. Gaza also resisted and was taken after a 2-month siege. From Gaza, Alexander marched to Egypt, which welcomed him as a liberator from hated Persian rule. The Egyptians, who had rebelled against Persia multiple times and suffered harsh reprisals, saw Alexander as sent by the gods to free them. Alexander was crowned pharaoh in Memphis, adopting Egyptian royal titles and performing traditional religious ceremonies. He visited the Oracle of Ammon at the Siwa oasis in the Libyan desert, where the priests supposedly confirmed his divine parentage, declaring him son of Zeus Ammon. Whether Alexander truly believed in his divinity or merely used it for political purposes is debated, but from this point he increasingly emphasized his special relationship with the gods. In Egypt, Alexander founded the city of Alexandria at the mouth of the Nile, the first and greatest of many cities he would name after himself. Alexandria was brilliantly sited to become a commercial center, linking Egypt with the Mediterranean world. It would grow into one of the ancient world's greatest cities, famous for its lighthouse, library, and museum, and serving as capital of Ptolemaic Egypt for 3 centuries. After organizing Egyptian affairs, Alexander marched back to Syria in spring 331 to confront Darius, who had assembled another massive army in Mesopotamia. The decisive battle of Alexander's conquest came at Gaugamela near the Tigris River in October 331. Darius had learned from previous defeats and chose a broad plain where his numerical superiority and cavalry could be fully deployed. He commanded perhaps 200,000 men, including cavalry, infantry from across the Persian Empire, war chariots with scythed wheels designed to cut through infantry formations, and even war elephants from India. Alexander's army numbered perhaps 47,000, hopelessly outnumbered but superbly trained and led. Darius had even levelled the ground to facilitate his chariot's charge. Alexander deployed his army with the phalanx in the centre, cavalry on both wings, and reserve units positioned to protect against encirclement by the larger Persian force. As battle began, the Persian chariots charged, but Macedonian light infantry and archers targeted the horses and drivers, breaking up the charge before it reached the phalanx. Those chariots that penetrated were allowed to pass through lanes in the formation and were dealt with by reserves. Alexander, as was his custom, led the companion cavalry on the right wing, waiting for his moment. As the battle lines engaged and Darius's cavalry attempted to outflank the Macedonian left, a gap opened in the Persian line. Alexander immediately charged into this gap, leading his cavalry in a wedge formation directly toward Darius. The Macedonian cavalry smashed through Persian infantry, cutting their way toward the king's position. Darius, once again seeing Alexander bearing down on him with unstoppable force, fled the battlefield. The Persian centre collapsed with the king's flight, though the Persian left wing had actually broken through the Macedonian line and was attacking the baggage train. Alexander had to turn back to rescue his camp, but the battle was won. Persian casualties were enormous, perhaps 40,000 killed, while Macedonian losses were relatively light. Darius fled eastward, and Alexander controlled Mesopotamia, the heartland of the Persian Empire. Alexander marched to Babylon, which surrendered without resistance. The great city opened its gates, and Alexander entered in triumph, offering sacrifices to Babylon's gods and presenting himself as legitimate successor to the ancient Mesopotamian kings. From Babylon he moved to Susa, another Persian capital, where he captured the imperial treasury containing 50,000 talents of gold and silver, vast wealth that would fund his future campaigns and the administration of his growing empire. Then he marched to Persepolis, the ceremonial capital of Persia, arriving in January 330. Persepolis held even greater treasures, and Alexander allowed his troops to plunder the city. Several months later, whether deliberately or during a drunken party as some sources claim, the great palace of Persepolis burned, destroying the symbolic centre of Persian power. Darius had fled to the eastern provinces, hoping to raise new armies and continue resistance. Alexander pursued him through the summer of 330, marching rapidly across the Iranian plateau. Darius's satraps, seeing the situation was hopeless, decided to save themselves by betraying their king. Bessus, satrap of Bactria, and other nobles murdered Darius and fled further east, hoping to continue resistance without their discredited king. When Alexander caught up, he found Darius dying by the roadside. According to legend, Alexander covered the dead king with his own cloak and sent the body back to Persepolis for royal burial, presenting himself as rightful successor to the Persian throne and avenger of Darius's murder, rather than merely a foreign conqueror. With Darius dead, Alexander was master of the Persian Empire, but his campaign was far from over. He spent the next 3 years campaigning in the eastern provinces, pursuing Bessus into Central Asia, fighting through what is now Afghanistan and Central Asian republics. The campaigning was brutal, involving guerrilla warfare in mountainous terrain, harsh weather, and hostile populations. Alexander founded cities garrisoned by Macedonian veterans and local women, establishing permanent Greek presence in Central Asia. He adopted Persian customs and dress, appointed Persian nobles to positions of authority, and encouraged his Macedonian officers to marry Persian women, policies that angered his Macedonian companions, who saw them as betraying Greek superiority. Tensions between Alexander and his closest companions erupted in tragic incidents. In 328, at a drunken banquet, Alexander and his old friend Cletus the Black quarrelled. Cletus criticised Alexander's adoption of Persian ways and his increasingly autocratic behaviour, while Alexander defended his policies and took offence at Cletus's accusations. The argument escalated until Alexander, in a drunken rage, seized a spear and killed Cletus, the man who had saved his life at the Granicus. Alexander was immediately overcome with remorse, mourning his friend and recognising the horror of what he had done. But the damage was done. Later, Alexander uncovered a conspiracy among his pages, young nobles who attended him. The conspiracy implicated Callisthenes, a historian travelling with the expedition and a nephew of Aristotle, who had criticised Alexander's adoption of Persian prostration rituals. Callisthenes was arrested and died in custody, further straining relations between Alexander and his companions. In 326, having pacified Central Asia, Alexander invaded India, crossing the Hindu Kush mountains and entering the Indus Valley. He defeated local rulers, including the famous battle against King Porus on the Hydaspes River. Porus commanded an army including 200 war elephants, which terrified the Macedonian horses. Alexander won through superior tactics, using his cavalry to flank the elephants and his infantry to attack them with javelins and pikes. After the battle, Alexander was impressed by Porus's courage and dignity in defeat, reinstating him as ruler of his territory as a Macedonian ally, and even expanding his kingdom. Alexander wanted to continue eastward, perhaps reaching the Eastern Ocean that Greeks believed encircled the world. But his army, having marched thousands of kilometres from home and fought for 8 years, refused to go further. At the Hephaestus River his soldiers mutinied, demanding to return home. Even Alexander's charisma and pleas could not change their minds. He sulked in his tent for 3 days, but finally accepted reality and ordered the return. The army marched back to the Indus, then split into 3 groups. One travelled by sea under the Admiral Nearchus, exploring the coast. Alexander led one group through the Gedrusian Desert, a horrific march through barren territory where thousands died of thirst and heat. The third group took a northern route through more hospitable terrain. By 324, the entire army had reunited in Persia. Alexander spent his remaining time organizing his empire, attempting to blend Greek and Persian elements into a unified state. He held a mass wedding at Susa, where 92 Macedonian and Greek officers married Persian noblewomen of the highest families, and 10,000 common soldiers married Asian women. Alexander himself married Statira, daughter of Darius, in addition to his first wife Roxana from Bactria. He enrolled 30,000 young Persians who had been trained in Macedonian warfare into his army. He planned new campaigns to Arabia and possibly to the western Mediterranean, but his body, worn down by wounds, hardships, and heavy drinking, was failing. In June 323, after days of heavy drinking at banquets in Babylon, Alexander fell ill with a fever. Over the course of 10 days, his condition deteriorated until he could no longer speak. He died on June 10th or 11th, 323, 1 month short of his 33rd birthday. He had conquered the known world from Greece to India, founded dozens of cities, spread Greek culture across 3 continents, and transformed the ancient world. But he left no clear succession plan. When asked on his deathbed who should inherit the empire, he supposedly whispered, "the strongest," or perhaps Crateros, his most capable general, but his words were unclear. His infant son by Roxana, also named Alexander, and his mentally disabled half-brother Philip Aridaeus were proclaimed joint kings, but real power lay with his generals. Alexander's death unleashed decades of warfare among his generals, known as the Diadochi or successors, who carved up his empire into separate kingdoms. The wars of the Diadochi lasted from 323 to 275, marked by constantly shifting alliances, betrayals, and battles across the eastern Mediterranean and Near East. Initially, generals like Perdiccas, Craterus, Antipater, and Ptolemy attempted to maintain unity while serving as regents for Alexander's infant son and disabled brother. But ambitions for independent power proved too strong. Perdiccas, who had received Alexander's signet ring and attempted to exercise supreme authority, was assassinated by his own officers in 321. Craterus died in battle the same year. Antipater, who had governed Macedonia during Alexander's expedition, died in 319, leaving power to Polyperchon, which angered other generals. The empire fractured as various commanders seized territories. Ptolemy established himself in Egypt, claiming Alexander's body when it was being transported to Macedonia and burying it in Alexandria, giving his rule legitimacy through connection to the conqueror. Seleucus took control of Babylonia and the eastern provinces, founding the Seleucid dynasty that would rule from Asia Minor to India. Antigonus Monophthalmus, the One-Eyed, controlled much of Asia Minor and Syria. Cassander seized power in Macedonia. Lysimachus ruled Thrace. These successor kings fought each other continuously, forming coalitions against whoever seemed strongest, then turning on former allies. Battles involving tens of thousands of soldiers and hundreds of war elephants decided the fates of provinces and kingdoms. The decisive Battle of Ipsus in 301 pitted Antigonus and his son Demetrius against a coalition of Seleucus, Lysimachus, and Cassander. Antigonus was killed and his empire divided among the victors. By 275, three major kingdoms had stabilized. The Ptolemaic kingdom controlled Egypt, Cyrenaica, Cyprus, and parts of the eastern Mediterranean coast. The Seleucid Empire held Syria, Mesopotamia, and much of the Near East and Iran, though the eastern provinces gradually broke away. The Antigonid kingdom ruled Macedonia and much of Greece, though Greek city-states maintained nominal independence and frequently rebelled. These Hellenistic kingdoms differed significantly from the classical Greek city-states. They were monarchies ruled by kings of Macedonian Greek origin, who claimed descent from Alexander's generals. They controlled vast territories with diverse populations including Greeks, Macedonians, native peoples of Egypt, Mesopotamia, Syria, Anatolia, and further east. The kings styled themselves as absolute rulers, adopting elements of Persian and Egyptian royal ideology while maintaining Greek cultural identity. They built magnificent capital cities that served as centers of royal power, Greek culture, and cosmopolitan mixing of peoples. Alexandria in Egypt became the greatest city of the Hellenistic world. Founded by Alexander and developed by the Ptolemies, it grew to perhaps 500,000 inhabitants, making it possibly the largest city in the world. The city featured a grid plan with wide streets, magnificent public buildings, and the famous lighthouse, the Pharos, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world. This lighthouse, standing over 100 meters tall, guided ships into the busy harbour with its fire beacon visible for kilometers. The Ptolemies established the Mouseion, a research institute and library that became the greatest centre of learning in the ancient world. Scholars from across the Mediterranean came to study in Alexandria, supported by royal patronage. The Library of Alexandria aimed to collect all the knowledge in the world, acquiring hundreds of thousands of scrolls through purchase, copying, and even confiscation from ships docking in the harbour. Scholars working at the library made fundamental contributions to mathematics, astronomy, geography, medicine, and literature. Euclid wrote his elements there, systematizing geometry in 13 books that remained the standard mathematical text for 2,000 years. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the Earth with remarkable accuracy by measuring the angle of the Sun at different latitudes. Aristarchus proposed a heliocentric model of the solar system 18 centuries before Copernicus. Herophilus and Erasistratus conducted anatomical dissections, making important discoveries about the human body. Literary scholars collected and edited the classical texts of Homer, Hesiod, and the great dramatists, establishing standardized versions that preserved these works for posterity. The Seleucid capital at Antioch on the Orontes River in Syria became another major center. Founded by Seleucus and named for his father Antiochus, the city was beautifully situated with a grid plan, colonnaded streets, and magnificent temples and palaces. It served as administrative center for the vast Seleucid territories and as a trading hub connecting the Mediterranean with the interior of Asia. Pergamon in Western Asia Minor, capital of the Attalid kingdom that broke away from Seleucid control, developed its own famous library, second only to Alexandria, and produced magnificent sculpture including the altar of Zeus with its dramatic frieze depicting the battle between gods and giants. The Hellenistic period saw Greek language and culture spread throughout the eastern Mediterranean and Near East, creating a cosmopolitan civilization that blended Greek and local elements. This cultural fusion is what we mean by Hellenistic, Greek-like rather than purely Greek. In the cities founded by Alexander and his successors, Greek was the language of government and high culture, but local languages and traditions persisted. Greek-style gymnasia, theatres and temples were built in cities from Spain to Afghanistan. Local elites adopted Greek education, dress and customs to advance in the royal service. Yet they maintained their ancestral religions and cultural practices, creating hybrid identities. This cultural synthesis produced remarkable innovations in art, philosophy and science. Hellenistic art moved away from the classical ideals of restraint and ideal beauty toward more emotional, dramatic and realistic representation. Sculptors created works showing extreme suffering, old age, childhood and different ethnic types. subjects that classical artists had largely avoided. The Laocoon group, depicting the Trojan priest and his sons being killed by serpents, exemplified the Hellenistic Baroque style with its writhing figures, agonized expressions, and dramatic composition. The Nike of Samothrace, with drapery swirling around the goddess's body as if blown by wind, demonstrated technical virtuosity in carving marble. The Venus de Milo presented feminine beauty with more naturalism and sensuality than classical sculptures. Philosophy developed in new directions, responding to the challenges of living in vast monarchical states rather than intimate city-states. Three major philosophical schools emerged. Epicureanism, founded by Epicurus, taught that the goal of life was pleasure, understood not as hedonistic indulgence but as absence of pain and mental tranquility. Epicureans advocated withdrawing from politics, cultivating friendships, and pursuing simple pleasures while avoiding anxiety about death and divine punishment. Stoicism, founded by Zeno of Citium, taught that virtue was the only good and that humans should live according to reason and nature, accepting whatever fate brings without emotional disturbance. Stoics emphasized duty, self-control, and cosmopolitanism, the idea that all humans are fellow citizens of the world. Skepticism, developed by Pyrrho, questioned whether certain knowledge was possible, and advocated suspending judgment to achieve tranquility. These philosophies offered practical guidance for individuals navigating the complex, uncertain world of Hellenistic kingdoms, where one's fate could change suddenly due to wars, political upheavals, or royal caprice. They provided personal moral frameworks less dependent on participating in civic life than classical philosophy had been. Mathematics and science flourished with royal patronage and the resources of great libraries. Archimedes of Syracuse made fundamental discoveries in geometry, physics, and engineering, calculating the value of pi, discovering principles of buoyancy and leverage, and inventing ingenious machines including compound pulleys, a screw pump, and war machines that defended Syracuse against Roman siege. Hellenistic literature produced new genres. The pastoral poetry of Theocritus idealized rural life and simple shepherds in contrast to complex urban civilization. Apollonius of Rhodes wrote the Argonautica, reviving epic poetry with the story of Jason and the Argonauts searching for the Golden Fleece, but with Hellenistic sensibilities including psychological complexity and romantic love. Callimachus experimented with learned, elusive poetry and created elegant epigrams. The development of the novel as a literary form began in this period with romantic adventure stories. Theatre evolved toward new comedy, exemplified by Menander, which focused on domestic situations, stock characters like clever slaves and star-crossed lovers, and mistaken identities rather than the political satire of old comedy. Greek city-states in this period maintained some independence, but were increasingly dominated by the Hellenistic kingdoms. Leagues of cities like the Achaean League and Aetolian League formed for mutual defence and to negotiate with the kingdoms as equals. Some cities like Athens and Sparta retained prestige due to their history, but had little real power. Rhodes became a major commercial centre and naval power, maintaining independence through skilled diplomacy. The city-states continued their traditional institutions, including assemblies and councils, but citizen participation declined as politics became less meaningful under the shadow of royal power. The Hellenistic kingdoms developed sophisticated administrative systems to govern their diverse territories. They employed large bureaucracies staffed by Greeks and educated locals. They conducted censuses, collected taxes efficiently, and maintained standing armies of professional soldiers rather than citizen militias. Trade flourished with improved harbours, roads, and commercial infrastructure. Standardized coinage facilitated commerce across vast distances. The kingdoms grew wealthy from controlling trade routes, agricultural production, and resources. They spent lavishly on building projects, military forces, and cultural patronage, creating magnificent cities and supporting artistic and intellectual achievement. Religion in the Hellenistic world became more cosmopolitan and syncretic. The traditional Greek gods were worshipped alongside local deities, often identified with each other. Zeus was equated with the Egyptian Ammon and the Syrian Baal. The Ptolemies promoted the cult of Serapis, a deity combining characteristics of Greek and Egyptian gods, who became popular throughout the Mediterranean. Mystery religions offering personal salvation and direct experience of divinity attracted many followers. The cult of Isis spread from Egypt across the Hellenistic world, promising her devotees protection and afterlife blessings. Ruler cult developed as kings were worshipped as gods or divine beings, drawing on Near Eastern traditions of divine kingship, but making Greeks uncomfortable with the idea of worshipping mortals. The Jews in Judea came under Hellenistic influence after Alexander's conquest. Under Ptolemaic and then Seleucid rule, many Jews adopted Greek language and customs while maintaining their ancestral religion. The Torah was translated into Greek as the Septuagint, making Jewish scriptures accessible to Greek speakers. But tensions between traditional Judaism and Hellenistic culture eventually exploded when the Seleucid king Antiochus IV tried to suppress Jewish religious practices and desecrated the temple in Jerusalem in 167. This sparked the Maccabean Revolt, a successful Jewish uprising that established an independent Jewish kingdom under the Hasmonean dynasty, demonstrating that not all peoples accepted Hellenization peacefully. The Hellenistic kingdoms gradually weakened through internal decay and external pressures. The Seleucid Empire faced rebellions and the loss of eastern territories to the Parthians, an Iranian people who built a powerful empire controlling Mesopotamia and Iran by the mid-2nd century. The eastern provinces, including Bactria and India, broke away, forming Indo-Greek kingdoms that ruled parts of Central Asia and northwestern India for several generations, creating remarkable cultural syntheses blending Greek and Buddhist elements. The Ptolemaic kingdom suffered from dynastic conflicts and native Egyptian rebellions. The Antigonids struggled to control Greece against increasingly powerful leagues and the rising threat of Rome. Rome, the Italian city-state that had gradually conquered the western Mediterranean during the 3rd century, turned its attention eastward in the 2nd century. Roman legions proved superior to Hellenistic armies, defeating Philip V of Macedon in 200, and Macedonia was reduced to a Roman client state before being annexed as a province in 148. The Seleucid Empire crumbled under Roman pressure and internal weakness, disintegrating into smaller kingdoms. The Attalid kingdom of Pergamon was bequeathed to Rome by its last king in 133. Only Ptolemaic Egypt maintained independence for another century, surviving through skillful diplomacy and by becoming essentially a Roman client state. The final act came in the 1st century before the Common Era. Egypt's last ruler was Cleopatra VII, a remarkable woman who spoke multiple languages, received excellent education in the Motion, and proved a skilled politician. She allied with Julius Caesar and then Mark Antony, using Roman power to maintain Egyptian independence. But when Octavian, later Augustus, defeated Antony and Cleopatra at the Battle of Actium in 31, Egypt's independence ended. Cleopatra and Antony committed suicide in 30, and Egypt became a Roman province. The Hellenistic period was over, and Rome now ruled the Mediterranean world. The Roman conquest of the Greek world marked a political end to Greek independence, but Greek cultural influence actually increased under Roman rule. The Romans were deeply impressed by Greek civilization, adopting Greek art, literature, philosophy, and education, while providing the political order and military power to unite the Mediterranean world. As the Roman poet Horace famously wrote, "Captive Greece captured her savage conqueror and brought civilization to rustic Rome." Greek became the language of the Eastern Roman Empire, spoken by educated people throughout the empire, and served as the lingua franca of commerce and diplomacy. Greek cities continued to thrive under Roman rule, maintaining their traditional institutions including assemblies, councils, magistracies, and law courts, though real power rested with Roman governors. Athens remained an intellectual centre where wealthy Romans sent their sons to study philosophy and rhetoric. The great philosophical schools founded by Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and Epicureans continued operating, training students in their traditions. New buildings were constructed, including the Tower of the Winds, an ingenious octagonal structure combining a sundial, water clock, and weather vane. The Roman Emperor Hadrian, a devoted admirer of Greek culture, beautified Athens with new buildings including a library and completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus, begun 6 centuries earlier. Greek literature continued to be produced, though often for Roman audiences. Plutarch wrote his Parallel Lives, biographical comparisons of famous Greeks and Romans that preserved invaluable historical information and influenced Western literature for centuries. Pausanias travelled through Greece writing his Description of Greece, a detailed guidebook that recorded buildings, artworks, local customs, and mythology, preserving knowledge of sites that would later be destroyed or buried. Greek historians like Polybius and Dionysius of Halicarnassus wrote histories explaining Rome's rise to power to Greek audiences. Greek continued to be the language of sophisticated literature and philosophy, even as Latin dominated law and administration in the Western Empire. The rise of Christianity transformed the Greek world. Christianity emerged in the 1st century from Jewish communities in Palestine, but spread rapidly through Greek-speaking cities of the Eastern Mediterranean. The New Testament was written in Greek, making Christian scriptures accessible to the educated Greek world. Early Christian theology was developed by Greek-speaking thinkers including Paul of Tarsus, who carried the new religion to Greek cities across Asia Minor and Greece. The Church Fathers, including Clement of Alexandria, Origen, Basil of Caesarea, Gregory of Nyssa, and John Chrysostom, were educated in Greek philosophy and literature, using Greek philosophical concepts to articulate Christian doctrine. Christianity absorbed and transformed Greek intellectual traditions, creating a synthesis that would shape European thought for millennia. The Roman Empire's division into eastern and western halves in the 4th century left the eastern provinces, the Byzantine Empire, as the continuation of Greek civilization under Christian and Roman forms. Constantinople, founded by Constantine the Great on the site of the ancient Greek city Byzantium, became the new capital, a magnificent city that would survive for over 1,000 years as the center of Greek culture and Orthodox Christianity. Byzantine culture was fundamentally Greek, speaking Greek, preserving Greek literature and learning and maintaining Greek Orthodox Christianity, even while claiming to be the Roman Empire. The Byzantine Empire preserved the heritage of ancient Greece through centuries when Western Europe had lost much classical learning. Byzantine scholars copied ancient manuscripts, studied classical authors, and maintained philosophical and scientific traditions. When Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in 1453, many Greek scholars fled to Italy, bringing manuscripts and knowledge that contributed to the Italian Renaissance. These scholars taught Greek to Western Europeans who had largely forgotten the language, enabling them to read classical texts in the original and sparking renewed interest in ancient Greek culture. The legacy of ancient Greece profoundly shaped Western civilization in countless ways. Greek political thought, particularly the Athenian development of democracy, provided models and inspiration for modern democratic governments. The concept of citizenship, of free individuals participating in self-governance, of equality before the law, and of political debate and persuasion rather than force, all derive from Greek practice. The American founding fathers and French revolutionaries looked to Athens as an example when creating their new systems of government, though they adapted Greek direct democracy into representative republics suited to larger states. Greek philosophy established the foundations of Western thought. Socrates' emphasis on rational inquiry and questioning of assumptions became fundamental to philosophical and scientific method. Plato's theory of forms, his political philosophy, and his dialogues exploring ethics, epistemology, and metaphysics influenced Christian theology, Islamic philosophy, and secular Western thought. Aristotle's systematic approach to knowledge, his logic, his ethics emphasizing virtue and the golden mean, his political analysis, and his scientific method of observation and classification shaped medieval and Renaissance learning and continue to influence modern philosophy. Greek drama gave birth to Western theatre. The tragedies of Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, with their exploration of human suffering, moral dilemmas, and the nature of justice, remain powerful and are still performed worldwide. Their themes of fate versus free will, individual versus state, and the consequences of pride resonate across cultures and centuries. Greek comedy, both the political satire of Aristophanes and the domestic situations of Menander's New Comedy, established comic traditions that evolved into modern comedy. The very structure of drama with its acts, conflicts, reversals, and resolutions derives from Greek theatrical practice. Greek art established standards of beauty and proportion that influenced Western art for millennia. The idealized human form of classical sculpture, the architectural orders and proportional systems of Greek temples, and the naturalistic representation of three-dimensional space on flat surfaces all became foundational principles. Renaissance artists studied ancient Greek sculpture and architectural remains, attempting to recreate classical beauty. Neoclassical movements in the 18th and 19th centuries explicitly revived Greek styles. Even modernist rejection of classical traditions acknowledged Greek art's importance by defining themselves against it. Greek literature created many of the genres that continue today. Epic poetry from Homer, historical writing from Herodotus and Thucydides, lyric poetry exploring personal emotions, philosophical dialogues, scientific and medical treatises, and the novel all originated in ancient Greece. Western literature continually returns to Greek myths and stories, retelling and reinterpreting them for new audiences. The Trojan War, Odysseus's journey, Oedipus's fate, Antigone's defiance, and countless other Greek stories remain part of our cultural vocabulary. Greek science and mathematics laid foundations for modern scientific thinking. The shift from mythological to natural explanations for phenomena, the use of observation and logic, the development of mathematical proof, and the systematization of knowledge into distinct fields all began in ancient Greece. Euclidean geometry remained the standard for 2,000 years. Archimedes' discoveries in physics and mathematics were not surpassed until the Renaissance. The medical ethics of Hippocrates still influence medicine today. The scientific method of hypothesis, observation, and reasoning traces back to Greek philosophers who first systematically investigated the natural world. The Greek language itself profoundly influenced modern languages, particularly in technical and scientific vocabulary. English and other European languages contain thousands of words derived from Greek. Scientific nomenclature in biology, medicine, astronomy, and other fields uses Greek roots. Academic and intellectual discourse frequently employs Greek-derived terms. The very word alphabet comes from the first two Greek letters, alpha and beta, while words like philosophy, democracy, theatre, history, mathematics, physics, and countless others come directly from Greek. The idea of Greece as the fountainhead of Western civilization became central to European and American identity, particularly from the Renaissance onward. European scholars, artists, and political thinkers looked to ancient Greece as a golden age of human achievement, a model to emulate and a source of wisdom. This sometimes involved idealization and selective reading of Greek history, emphasizing democracy, philosophy, and art while downplaying slavery, imperialism, and the exclusion of women from political life. Modern Greece itself, independent from Ottoman rule in the 19th century, has cultivated this heritage, seeing itself as heir to ancient glory even as it builds a modern nation. The study of ancient Greece continues to evolve. Archaeology keeps uncovering new evidence, from Linear B tablets revealing Mycenaean palace economies to underwater excavations discovering ancient shipwrecks with their cargoes. New interpretations challenge older views, examining Greek society from perspectives of women, slaves, foreigners, and other groups previously marginalized in both ancient and modern accounts. Digital humanities apply computational methods to analyze ancient texts and material culture in new ways, yet the fundamental achievements remain astounding. A relatively small population in a relatively brief period created political, intellectual, artistic, and cultural innovations that continue to shape our world more than 2 millennia later. The journey through 3,000 years of ancient Greek history reveals a civilization of remarkable creativity, complexity, and contradictions, from the Minoan palaces of Bronze Age Crete to Alexander's conquest of the Persian Empire, from the development of Athenian democracy to the philosophical schools that sought wisdom and virtue. From the epic poetry of Homer to the scientific investigations of Hellenistic scholars, ancient Greece gave humanity gifts that continue to enrich our lives. The Greeks were the first to ask many of the fundamental questions about justice, beauty, truth, and the good life that humans still grapple with today. They created art and literature that speaks across the centuries. They developed political systems that empower citizens to govern themselves. They pioneered rational inquiry into the natural world. But Greek history also reminds us of the costs of these achievements. The glory of Athens was built partly on empire and slavery. The freedom of Greek citizens depended on the labour of the enslaved and the exclusion of women, foreigners, and others from political participation. The competitive spirit that drove Greek cultural achievement also fueled destructive wars between city-states. The confidence in reason and human potential coexisted with religious beliefs in capricious gods and reliance on oracles. Greek history shows us both the heights of human achievement and the moral failures and tragedies that accompany them. Understanding ancient Greece helps us understand ourselves and our own societies. The questions the Greeks asked about democracy, about how to balance individual freedom with community needs, about what education should accomplish, about the relationship between might and right, remain our questions. Their struggles with empire, with relations between different cultures and peoples, with the consequences of technological change, mirror our own. Their artistic and intellectual achievements inspire us to create and think boldly. The legacy of ancient Greece is not a static inheritance, but a living conversation across the centuries. Each generation rediscovers Greek thought, art and literature, finding new meanings and relevance. What the Renaissance found in Greek manuscripts differs from what Enlightenment thinkers drew from Greek philosophy, which differs from what contemporary scholars discover through new archaeological and analytical methods. This ongoing engagement with ancient Greece enriches our culture and connects us to a tradition of human inquiry and creativity stretching back millennia. As we conclude this journey through ancient Greek history, we recognize that we have covered an enormous amount of material, yet barely scratched the surface of this rich and complex civilization. Every topic mentioned deserves deeper exploration. Every figure discussed led a life far more interesting than a brief mention can convey. Every event occurred within context we could only gesture toward. But perhaps this overview has provided a framework for understanding how ancient Greece developed, what it achieved, and why it matters. Perhaps it has sparked curiosity to learn more about particular aspects that fascinated you. The Greeks themselves valued curiosity, seeing it as the beginning of wisdom. May their example inspire us to keep asking questions, seeking knowledge, and striving to understand our world and ourselves. If you enjoyed this journey through the entire history of ancient Greece, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps us continue creating detailed historical content, exploring the civilizations, events, and people that shaped our world. There's so much more history to discover together, from other ancient civilizations to medieval kingdoms to modern nations. Join us as we continue uncovering the fascinating stories of humanity's past. Thank you for watching, and until next time, keep exploring history.